This is my 40 gallon or 150 litre planted community tank, and it's just over 1 year old. For today's video, I'm going to be giving you a full recap covering how I set it up, some of the key moments over the last year, the current state of the tank, as well as my plans for it in the future. So let's rewind all the way back to the beginning when I first set this aquarium up with a couple of inches of aquasoil at the bottom. As usual, I went with Fluval Stratum aquasoil as it's cheap where I live, but I know it can be pricey in other areas. For the hardscape, I knew from the start that I wanted to use spiderwood. It's cheap, easy to work with, and doesn't release a lot of tannins that can turn the water brown. I spent some time experimenting with different layout ideas until I found a setup that I liked. To hold everything together, I used tissue paper between the individual wood pieces as a bonding surface and then secured everything in place with glue. Now spiderwood tends to float, so I do need something to weigh it all down. I started by using black lava rock since it's lightweight, cheap, and gives some anchoring for the driftwood. Once I was happy with the structure, I moved it over to the tank and arranged everything in the places where I wanted them. I chose to cycle this aquarium using the dark start method, and I link to a more detailed video that I have in the description if you want to learn more about it. But in short, you add your substrate and hardscape to the tank, set up your filter, and then dose the tank with an ammonia solution to simulate the waste from your fish. This helps build up the beneficial bacteria colonies before you add any livestock to the tank to keep everything safe. By the second day, some of the hardscape had started to float around the tank as lava rock is pretty light and often traps air within it, so I added a bit of Seiryu stone to keep everything grounded. Unfortunately, this tank sits directly across from my main aquarium rack, so it gets a lot of ambient light from my other tanks. Because of that, algae started growing pretty quickly in this specific setup, but it's not a problem, it's just a natural result of the excess nutrients from the cycling process combined with the extra light. Even though this doesn't look great, algae at this stage of the tank setup is actually a good sign in my opinion, as it shows that life is starting to take hold in the tank. But most people won't run into this since tank lights usually stay off with this cycling method, and not everyone has a wall of aquariums opposite their tank throwing extra light into it to encourage the algae to grow. You don't really need to clean the algae at this point either, as it will probably grow back due to the amount of excess nutrients in the tank, but for whatever reason I decided to give the tank a bit of a tidy up. It's very easy to scrub the tank glass clean with a little bit of sponge, and a simple siphon and bucket will do the trick for removing the softer algae types grown on any hardscape. So after a quick cleanup, this is what I was left with, but the cycle is still ongoing, so at this point of the build there's really not much to do but wait. After a few weeks of cycling, the tank was ready to be planted. I started by placing some Echinodorus renii in the mid-ground and some Echinodorus Cordifolius Fluitans in the background, but don't worry about all of the stuff being kicked up off the substrate, it's just excess algae from the cycling process. Next, I added 2 Echinodorus Aquartica plants to the left-hand side of the hardscape and an Echinodorus red diamond in the background area. Echinodorus Aquartica is a great small-sized sword plant that's generally easy to keep, and I was hoping to use the red diamond for some pops of red in the back. For the right-hand hardscape island, I chose to use Java Fern as the main feature plant, and they don't need to be planted in the substrate, you simply mount them to the hardscape. These are regular Java Fern as in Microsorum terapis, and in my tanks they generally do okay, but some people can have problems with these plants melting and never regrown. I'm not sure if this is a nutrient issue or a problem with the mineral content in the tap water, but some of the smaller Java Fern variants melt in my setup, so I am starting to move more towards Anubias. Speaking of Anubias, I then added a selection of Anubias plants to bulk out the foliage on that side of the tank, as Anubias is very hardy and perfect for hardscape based setups. Once I was happy with how the right hand island looked, I moved to the central island and filled it with even more Anubias because I really like this plant. Over the past year, I've really come to love how this particular Anubias island has filled out, as it looks great, it's very easy to maintain, and it doesn't matter where you are in the world, you should easily be able to get at least one type of Anubias in your area. If you are new to planted tanks, Anubias really is a fantastic choice, and I have a dedicated video going over some of my favourite types I'll link in the description. Not only does Anubias help build out the plant mass and foliage in your tank, but it doesn't need expensive high intensity lighting, liquid fertilisers or CO2 injection. It is perfect for low-tech tanks like this one. With the centre hardscape island packed with Anubias, I decided to add my Bucephalandra to the right hand island for some fine detailing. Buce has worked very well in my setups, but I have seen other people struggle with it, and this is probably due to differences in tap water mineral content. This specific variant is Bucephalandra Kedagang, and it's always done well in my tanks regardless of the setup, and I do think it's one of the hardier types of Bucephalandra in the hobby. Then it was time to add the carpet to the tank to try and get a nice lush green setup in the foreground. I planted a couple of in vitro cups of Harlequin Telenum green in the foreground of the tank to fill it out over the coming months. At this point of the tank build, I wasn't actually planning on keeping my Corydoras in this tank, so I didn't mind having a carpet and plant in this area. Harlequin Telenum green has always been one of the best low-tech carpet and plants that I've used in any of my tanks regardless of setup. It's very hardy and adaptable, easy to care for, it spreads well via runners to cover the substrate in the area you want carpeting, and it's usually cheap and easy to find in shops. To fill out the background of the tank, I trimmed some of the excess Hygrophila polysperma from another tank and transferred it over. In general, Hygrophila polysperma has done well in most of my low-tech setups, but it can be temperamental in certain tanks. Once it's established, it tends to grow very quickly and helps soak up excess nutrients that may otherwise become harmful to your fish. I also decided to get some Rotala Rotundifolia cuttings from one of my other aquariums too. If I could only recommend one low-tech stem plant to the people watching this video, Rotala Rotundifolia would be it. I have a dedicated video explaining why I think it's actually a super plant for the aquarium hobby, and I'll link to that in the description, but basically it's cheap, very easy to grow, great at consuming excess nutrients in the tank, and I think it looks great. After planting everything, I placed some root tabs beneath the Echinodorus plants, but the more I learn about planted tanks, the less I think these are necessary. I know that a lot of people say that Echinodorus and cryptocorynes are heavy root feeders, but I honestly think that this is just a myth. At this stage of the build, you can still see a layer of the brown diatom algae on the substrate, but it's amazing how quickly shrimp and snails can clean that up, so I don't pay any attention to it on a new tank setup. I wanted to add some floating plants to this new tank, so I moved some salvinia over from one of my other aquariums. Floating plants not only provide surface cover to help keep certain fish species calm and relaxed, but they also help to naturally purify the water, keeping your fish safe and healthy. This is what the tank looked like at this stage of the build, but it still felt empty to me, so I wanted to add some more stem plants to the background. Luckily, my Wollstad Betterfish tank had plenty of Rotala Rotundifolia and Ludwigia Mini Super Red available. So I trimmed the excess and planted them in the 40-gallon tank using the Rotala to back up the left hand side and the Ludwigia to add some pops of red on the right. Finally, I moved some pothos over from my 29-gallon tank. I really like the look of emergent plants climbing out of the side of aquariums, but I know some people don't like it. Emergent plants help absorb excess nutrients in the tank, which can otherwise lead to algae problems and stress your fish, but I ended up having to remove the pothos because it was a little bit too good at this and my aquatic plants started to have nutrient issues. So, with the tank fully cycled and planted, it was time to start bringing in some livestock, and I decided to start with some algae eaters to try and help get this brown diatom and soft green algae growth under control. Initially, I decided to go with a mix of orange Neocaridina shrimp and a group of Armano shrimp, although half of the Armanos were for one of my friends. They were just temporary guests in my tanks until his was ready. In my experience, Armano shrimp are some of the best algae eaters in the hobby. Not only do they eat a wide range of algae types, but they also help with leftover fish food and detritus in your aquarium. Neocaridina are often underrated in this role, but in my experience they do a great job with soft algae types and also add some nice pops of colour to the aquarium. I started by floating both shrimp bags on the water's surface to let them temperature match gradually to avoid any risk of temperature shock in the shrimp. Then I added the shrimp species to their own individual acclimation tubs, and I slowly added water from the aquarium to the shipping water they came in. Then I poured the Armano shrimp tub through a net to discard the shipping water and catch the shrimp, and then gently release them into the tank. The Armano shrimp spread out quickly and took a few minutes to get used to their new home before starting to explore and get to work on eating the algae. Armano shrimp aren't the flashiest shrimp in the hobby, and they can be a little expensive because it's challenging to breed them, but they are seriously effective at keeping algae growth in check. Next, I did the same with the orange Neocaridina and poured their acclimation tub through a net to get rid of the water and catch the shrimp before releasing them into the tank. My strategy is simple, and I use Neocaridina shrimp to focus on the softer algae types in large numbers as they're very easy to breed, which encourages the Armano shrimp to focus on the tougher algae types like hair algae. Neocaridina are also excellent at eating detritus and uneaten food in the tank, helping to prevent any water quality issues. Finally, I picked up a couple of horned neurite snails from one of my other tanks and moved them over to this setup. Neurite snails, regardless of the species, are also excellent at cleaning algae, eating leftover food, and dealing with detritus. I know a lot of people don't like snails in their tanks, and there's a lot of crossover between snails and shrimp, so you can definitely get the job done with shrimp if needed. A few days later, my first batch of fish arrived for this tank, and I had 3 Hony Gourami, 15 cardinal tetras, and 15 Harlequin Rasboras. I floated the bags in the tank to temperature match the water and avoid any risk of temperature shock. After they'd acclimated, I poured the bags through a net to get rid of the shipping water and then added the 3 Gourami to the tank. At first they stuck together, probably for comfort because they're in a new environment, and even though they are the largest fish in the tank by far, they didn't know this. Next, I added the cardinal tetras, and these were completely washed out when they come, probably due to the stress of shipping, and they'd lost all of their colour. I was actually a little concerned at first, but once they settled in, their vibrant red and blue hues quickly returned, and now the fish look amazing. Being in a brand new environment, the cardinal tetras grouped up tightly and shoaled around the tank, but this isn't something you can regularly expect from cardinal tetras, so don't buy these fish expecting them to do this in your tank constantly. Then came the Harlequin Rasboras, and like the cardinal tetras, these also grouped up and shoaled around until they'd adjusted and got used to their new home. Even now, the Harlequin Rasboras occasionally shoal together, seemingly at random, but again, this is not something that is reliable, so don't buy Harlequin Rasboras just because you see them shoal in this video. One pleasant surprise was seeing my Neocaridina shrimp safely move across the intake of my Fluval FX2 canister filter without it being able to suck them in, because this was one of my main concerns with the setup. This is what the tank looked like at this stage of the build, with both the cardinal tetras and the Harlequin Rasboras still shoaling around due to being in an unfamiliar space. I really wish more freshwater fish species would reliably display this shoaling behaviour, because it does look amazing, but as the fish get more comfortable to their new environment, this shoaling behaviour tends to taper off. All of this extra movement in the tank seemed to spook the Hony Gourami, and they ended up retreating to the top right hand corner of the tank for a couple of hours. Then they gradually gained some confidence and began exploring their new home, getting more comfortable with their surroundings, and I left everyone to settle in. Over the next few weeks, everything ran pretty smoothly, but I did notice that some of the Harlequin Rasboras had developed white patches on their lips, which had me worried, thinking it might be mouth fungus. After doing some research, I came across a few other Harlequin Rasbora keepers who seem to believe that this is likely a stress response, and thankfully the white marks on the fish faded over time. I also noticed that one of the Harlequin Rasboras was deformed, and unfortunately this one didn't make it. It's always sad to lose fish, but with a species as popular as Harlequin Rasboras, occasional issues like this are to be expected just because of the scale of the breeding of the species. Meanwhile, the cardinal tetras had fully coloured up and settled into their new aquarium. They stopped shoaling tightly and began swimming more independently, which is usually a good sign that they are feeling more relaxed and comfortable in their new environment. The horned neurite snails were doing their thing, working their way around the tank, grazing on the algae and keeping themselves to themselves as expected. I did start to lose a few of the orange Neocaridina shrimp, but in my experience, the orange line of Neocaridinas has always been a little bit more fragile than the other colours I've personally kept. My red and yellow Neocaridina lines have definitely been more resilient, and I would definitely recommend either of those to people new to the shrimp keeping side of the hobby over the orange ones. That said, the shrimp were still active, helping to clean up the soft algae and any leftover food in the tank. Around this time, my friend's tank was ready, so I netted his half of the Armano shrimp up and handed them over. The remaining Armano shrimp didn't seem too bothered, and they continued to focus on algae control and eating anything they could find. It was also around this stage that I decided to remove the carpeting plants and introduce 5 Corydoras catfish along with a small group of neon tetras. I also decided to remove the Hygrophila polysperma in the back of the tank, as it grows incredibly fast and tends to shoot off in random directions, which ends up disrupting the overall tank layout. I chose to replace it with more Rotala Rotundifolia, which grows a little bit slower, meaning it requires less maintenance, while it also has a far more predictable vertical growth pattern while still offering many of the same benefits as the Hygrophila. This helped cut down on the maintenance requirements of the tank and reduce the chances of stray stems popping up in places I didn't want them. Then, the only real major issue that I've had with this tank started to show up, and it was blackbeard algae. Technically, this is a mix of both blackbeard algae and staghorn algae, but unlike the softer green and brown algae types I'd had earlier due to the cycling process, I wasn't actually expecting this one. Both blackbeard and staghorn algae are hair algae types which have far tougher fibres than the softer varieties that my shrimp and snails were already consuming. While Armano shrimp and horned neurite snails can eat hair algae, they definitely prefer the softer, easier algae types, and there was still plenty of that in the tank, so they basically ignored the hair algae. As a result, the blackbeard and staghorn algae slowly began to take over the aquarium. I kept manually removing large amounts of it, but it just kept coming back stronger each time. After doing a lot of research and sifting through a lot of conflicting advice, I decided to test my phosphate levels. The results showed a 2 ppm level of phosphate in this particular tank, which was significantly higher than the 0 to 0.25 ppm that I usually see in my other aquariums. Then I decided to add a juvenile Siamese algae to help get the hair algae under control, and while it definitely did its best, its small size and appetite just couldn't keep up with the algae growth. Eventually, I traced the problem back to my Fluval FX2 canister filter. The filter media had gathered a lot of decaying organic matter, and that detritus breaking down was likely the cause of the phosphate spike that was fueling this algae growth. I know that there's a bit of a trend on social media and YouTube where people go as long as possible without cleaning their canister filters, but I honestly think this is a mistake. So I gave my FX2 a thorough deep clean, removing all of the built up gunk and detritus from the different types of filter media. After that, the phosphate levels dropped back in line with my other tanks and the blackbeard and staghorn algae started to disappear. As the hair algae started to fade, some of the fish in the tank decided it was a good time to start a family. First up were my Hony Gourami, and unfortunately one of the females didn't make it, but the remaining pair reached breeding age and got down to business. The male spent a huge amount of time tending his bubble nest, constantly maintaining it and caring for the eggs that the female produced. But after a couple of weeks and no sign of any fry, I decided they were likely eating their own young. Still, it was fascinating to watch how dedicated the male was to maintaining that bubble nest, and it pretty much became his entire world. He decided to stay tucked up in the top right corner right next to the nest while the female patrolled the rest of the tank, often chasing the other fish if they got too close. Then, one day, I spotted something, and it was dozens of tiny baby Hony Gourami scattered across the top right hand side of the tank. I don't remember the exact number, but I'm pretty sure I had over 100 fry at one point. Unfortunately, this caused their parents' aggression to ramp up significantly, and they were constantly chasing the other tank mates away if they came too close to their babies. But after a few days, all of the fry were gone, and I'm not sure if they were eaten by their parents and tank mates or if they just couldn't find enough food to survive. Since the breeding behaviour and heightened aggression were consistent, I decided to rehome my Hony Gourami. Thankfully, a good friend of mine has a dedicated Hony Gourami tank with a couple of Siamese algae eaters in there, so I passed them on to him and moved my Hony Gourami over to this community tank. I'd still love to set up a dedicated Hony Gourami tank one day, but when it comes to this type of community setup, I do think Hony Gourami are a better fit. They've got that beautiful yellow colour, and I've never seen them act aggressively towards any of their tank mates, not even the tiny little shrimp. Next up were my Corydoras, who'd settled into the tank very well and apparently decided that it was time to start a family. When I first bought them, I didn't realise that albino Corydoras anais were prolific breeders. In short, if these fish are happy, they'll be spawning and leaving eggs all over your tank. Thankfully though, unlike the Hony Gourami, Corydoras don't provide any parental care to their young. The females simply lay their eggs on surfaces in their environment and then move on, letting nature take its course, so there's no problems with aggression from the parents. The two female Corydoras seem to be constantly carrying eggs almost non-stop, and their spawning behaviour only really slowed down during the winter months. Unfortunately for them, my Siamese algae eater, who'd grown into a young adult by this point, had developed a taste for Corydoras eggs. It would literally follow the females around the tank and snack on their eggs as soon as they'd laid them onto the surface. It actually seemed like the extra protein from the eggs had boosted its growth, because the Siamese algae eater definitely seemed to shoot up in size during this time. I was starting to worry about the females constantly producing eggs, especially when I noticed that some of the eggs were getting stuck on their fins instead of properly attached to the surfaces, but they do seem to be fine. If my Corys spawn as much this year as they did last year, I'm definitely going to try and remove some of the eggs before the Siamese algae eater can eat them, to see if I can hatch them out and get some baby Corydoras. Next up are the Harlequin Rasboras, who also decided it was a good time to start a family. These guys are very active spawners, and while they didn't bother their tank mates directly in the form of aggression, their constant darting around the tank did seem to spook my Tetras and Gourami, so they ended up hiding in the plant cover. I haven't managed to catch it on camera yet, but it is interesting to watch how the female Harlequins flip upside down to lay their eggs on the undersides of broad-leafed plants in the tank. As I mentioned, the Harlequins just ignore the other fish in the tank during their spawning, but a lot of the species definitely tweak their behaviour due to all of the sudden movement. Just like the Corydoras, the Harlequins spawned for months and months and months and didn't really stop until winter set in, even though this is a tropical heated aquarium. Moving on, and we get to the Neocaridina shrimp, and after losing so many of the original orange Neocaridina shrimp colony that I added, I started to move some of the cherry and yellow Neocaridina over from my other tanks. It didn't take long for them to settle in and start breeding, and now there's a healthy little breeding colony in this tank. The only issue is that even with a pre-filter sponge on my Fluval FX2 canister filter, some of the baby and juvenile Neocaridina still get inside. They usually end up hanging out in the filter until I do a maintenance session and return them to the aquarium. Thankfully though, they seem happy enough stuck in the filter, grazing on the detritus and leftover food that it collects. After removing the Pearl Gourami, I felt it was safe enough to move my chili Rasboras into this tank, and thankfully they've settled in nicely. These are tiny fish and I just didn't want to risk keeping them with Pearl Gourami given the size difference and potential for them to become food. I've had a few comments pointing out that not all of these are true chili Rasboras, and I completely agree. I was brand new to the Boraras genus back when I initially got them, but my friend's dad is a big fan and keeps a few different species from the genus. He's convinced that at least one of mine is actually a strawberry Rasbora, and he's pretty sure that a few of the other ones are also from different species of the genus. Still, I collectively refer to them as my chili Rasboras because that's what they were sold to me as. They tend to stick to the top right hand corner of the tank and keep themselves to themselves, which works out well in this tank as everything seems to be leaving each other alone. My Hony Gourami also quickly settled into this tank, and they've been great additions, and I love their pop of yellow. These are very peaceful, they keep themselves to themselves and they generally don't bother anyone. The only downside is that they are part of the Anabantoid order of fish, and they can sometimes go into a sort of hiding mode for long periods of the day and just decide to hide behind a leaf or in a shady spot, and there's nothing you can do to get them out until they're ready. I'd guess that they're probably visible and active for 30 to 50% of the time each day, depending on what's happening in the tank. Just like the Tetras, my Hony Gourami definitely seems skittish and scared of the Harlequin Rasboras when they dart around the tank during breeding season. I keep 2 male Hony Gourami in this tank, with each of them having claimed their own territory in here, but they'll still come out and swim around the tank together, and they seem to play with their modified ventral fins, sort of tapping each other to say hi when they pass. I want to quickly touch on a problem I had with my Java Fern, and this particular clip is from month 5, and as you can see, the Java Fern leaves are looking healthy with no signs of any nutrient deficiencies. But if we skip ahead to this clip from month 8, you can see that there's small holes starting to form, and this is usually a sign of a potassium deficiency. Interestingly, none of the other plants in the tank seem to be affected, and I'd expect to see similar issues with the Anubias and Echinodorus, but they continue to look fine and free from problems. As time progressed, more and more tiny holes began showing up on the Java Fern leaves in this tank. My friend's dad recommended that I start adding spinach to the tank as a food source for my shrimp, snails and Siamese algae eater, while also increasing the nutrient profile for the Java Fern. Spinach is high in potassium, and it does seem that the potassium from the waste of my livestock that eat the spinach helps to increase the overall levels in the water and benefit the plants. This is footage of the Java Fern right now, and as you can see, it's definitely bounced back and none of the new leaves on the plant have any holes in them anymore. So that brings us up to the present day, and this is what the tank is currently looking like. I know that it's overgrown and wild, but I honestly really like the jungle aquascape look, and I do love it when it looks like this. I've removed the Salvinia floating plant from the tank and replaced it with duckweed and water lettuce, which now cover the entire surface of the aquarium. This combination has been incredibly effective at pulling excess nutrients from the water, helping to keep my fish, shrimp and snails healthy. It's also taken a lot of the nutrient uptake pressure off the dense dense jungle of Rotala Rotundifolia grown in the background of the tank. Since I have Rotala Rotundifolia in a lot of my aquariums, I have been thinking about doing a mini rescape in the background of this tank soon just to switch things up. Right now I am leaning towards removing all of the stem plants in the back and replacing them with a mixture of Echinodorus and cryptocoryne plants. The Ludwigia Mini Super Red has started to struggle lately, but I suspect this might be due to the reduced light and availability as the duckweed and water lettuce cover the surface and block out a lot of light. Thankfully, there's still plenty of Echinodorus plant varieties that offer red tones, so I can still get some colour in this section of the tank if I want. In theory, swapping out the dense upright stems of the Rotala for some broadleaf plants like Echinodorus and cryptocorynes should help open the tank up visually while also still providing hiding places for my fish. At the same time, it should also increase the amount of available swimming space for any species such as the Harlequin Rasboras that want to go into that area of the tank. I'm really happy with how the Anubias Islands turned out, and for now I have no plans to change it at all. I'm just going to leave it as it is and let the Anubias plants on here continue to grow out over the coming year and just see what happens with it. The right hand island that's dominated by the Java Fern but has some Anubias and some Bucephalandra is not so certain for now. If the holes do start to come back in the Java Fern, then I'll replace that with different types of Anubias, but I'll just keep building up the epiphyte plants that live on that island. I really like the look of the Echinodorus Cordifolius Fluitans in the back left corner of the tank, and it's really filled out nicely the last couple of months, but I would like some kind of smaller Echinodorus or cryptocoryne plant just to go in front of it to fill the tank out a little bit more. I know you can keep Corydoras in tanks with a plant-based carpet, but they just seem to love foraging around in the aquasoil, so for now I have no plans to add any type of carpet and plant back into this tank, and I want to keep the foreground as it is even though it does look bare. I don't have any plans to immediately change the stocking of the tank either, but ideally I would like to get a different tank set up for the cardinal and neon tetras to be moved over to, for a species specific tank so they can free swim around where they want without being scared of their tank mates. I'd also love to get a dedicated Hony Gourami tank set up as they are my favourite fish, and I do have my eye on a specific setup, but the main limitation I have right now is space, and I am leaning towards taking down a fair few tanks and upscaling them to larger tanks that I can do more with. But because so many of my tanks are nano tanks, I do think that my chili Rasboras could be moved over to a dedicated species specific tank and thrive in there. I'm excited to see how things evolve over the next year, and I definitely plan to make a follow-up video similar to this one once the tank reaches the 2-year milestone. Anyway guys, that brings the video to an end. Thanks for watching, especially if you made it all the way to the end, and good luck with your aquariums.